Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be an old sage occasionally. I've often said the only qualification I have for my new role as aging facility commissioner is that I'm old and aging. So that's it's one of those roles which ideally suits my age. Look, if I speak for a little while, not too long, and Joanna, make sure you stop me, then we can have lots of discussion. So I think it's always dangerous to play soothsayer in this space. This is a particular crisis unlike that which we've experienced because the genesis of it is quite different. But I do think it's helpful just to go back a little bit. So in the last 40 years, we've had two recessions and then a dip following the GFC, and now we're into our third formal recession. And undoubtedly, the next set of figures will show that. So if we could just go back to 1982 just for a moment, there was a recession there. The Liberal government was in power. The coalition government was in power. It coincided with a drought, and it had unemployment of just over 10%. In many senses, nothing immediately changed except for this, which was very significant. It was followed by the election of the Hawke-Keating governments. And in that period of time that followed that recession, there was a wholesale change in a number of things. Firstly, there was major reforms that were initiated by the Hawke-Keating governments in relation to macroeconomic reforms, changing to the banking system, changing to our financial arrangements, and generally. The second thing that came out of it, because there was a rising inflation, was the compact with the unions. And that was perhaps one of the most significant policy interventions that we'd seen for a very long time. And so that crisis did, in fact, lead to political and policy change quite substantially. The second thing that happened was it was followed in 1990 and 1991 by a second recession, which was even deeper. It was the one that Keating, I presume, thoughtfully said there was the recession, we had to have. But that figures of 12% unemployment, quite significant, very substantial, about the same length of time as the first recession, 2 years in total, 18 months, 2 years. But what followed that period of time was very significant for the sector. The sector went into survival mode, and I think I've said this previously. The sector agencies became obsessed about their operational capacity and resilience, and in many senses, governments took a very assertive role in their place. And I've mentioned this, I think, at a FONGA meeting last year or maybe the year before. And in that period of time, that early 90s, we saw a very substantial increase in the government believing that it was right and it was in control and it knew what to do. And that was very important. The second thing that was happening was the stuff coming out of America about the market economy, and in particular, the notion that markets provided the answers to just about everything. So we saw the really ramping up of the marketisation of human services and just about everything in the 1990s under the Labor government. And the sector was not well prepared for that. The third was that the unions were very strong and supportive in relation to workplace issues. And when I was president of ACOS during that time, we had good alliances with the union. But one of the problems was the unions wouldn't accept the changing nature of the workplace, that is, what was about to happen in terms of contracting out and also the casualisation of the workers. And so whilst they had a very good accord with the Hawke-Keating governments, the landscape was changing rapidly under their feet. And I think in hindsight, none of us were able to really make a dent in what was happening at that particular time. But the point that I want to raise was there was a significant change in the way in which government saw itself, strangely enough. The GFC came along, as you know, in 2017, and unemployment in Australia went to about 5.7, I think, percent. And we didn't go into a recession, largely because of the stimulus package by the Rudd and then Gillard governments. And that forestalled the recession occurring that would have otherwise occurred. everybody thought the GFC would have changed the way in which society, business and governments operated. And I was a commissioner at the Productivity Commission at that time, or before, around that time, and the answer is it didn't. What basically happened was it was put down to rogue companies, poor quality regulation, particularly in America, and frankly, rogue individuals making poor choices. And despite the severity of the GFC and some regulatory interventions across the world in relation to banking and financial arrangements, actually nothing changed. The world didn't learn the lessons. And yet, if we look back at the GFC, the hallmarks of the weakening of the market system and the capital system that we have were, in fact, I think, foreshadowed in that. But again, neither the sector nor the governments fundamentally changed or shifted as a consequence of that GFC. And so the point of making that comment is we're now into this third recession, but the factors giving rise to it are entirely unique. We've never had a recession induced by a health crisis. Most recessions, you can see them coming. There can be a particular shock, like in the case of the GFC, but generally they are not, you don't fall off a cliff immediately, and here we have. Nobody can predict with certainty the depth of the recession or its length, but traditionally Australia has about 18 months to 2 years worth of recession. This one, the unemployment figure is hard to tell. It's likely to be around 10% or worse. At the moment, it's not completely clear because of the JobKeeper arrangements. So the question for us is whether or not this is such a shock to the system that, unlike the GFC, this is the time for fundamental change in the way we run our economy and our society. And I think that's what really those in the sector in New South Wales and generally have to really be attentive to in a way that we were not as attentive as we should have been following 1990-1991 recession. Now, that's not to say the sector wasn't, but it was true that we had a survivalist mentality in parts of it. My view here is that we're in a survivalist mode at the moment. A lot of the sector is in a bit of a shell shock because their funding base, particularly philanthropic funding base, is being squeezed. Some organisations' viability is seriously in doubt. And everything is operational at the moment, particularly if you're in the age and disability areas. But at your level and at NCOS level, it's important to stay a bit above that. So just if I can very briefly, I'll just raise a number of very brief issues and then open it up for questions because you know what you want to hear about. I think this particular crisis has raised, for me, sector resilience in a very significant way. It's now clear that the sector is not as resilient as it should be. Now, there are very resilient players in this sector and most will survive. But there's two or three things that I think emerge very importantly. The first is we've got to get the funding of the sector right. And that has to, and it's been something we've looked at. We looked at it in the Productivity Commission report in 2010. It was looked at in the Industry Commission in 1995. But fundamentally what this crisis has shown is that very few NGOs have sufficient reserves to survive shock. And we've got to get to a mentality where the sector understands the importance of building reserves and governments accept that in the funding arrangements, reserves are an essential feature of sustainability. Too many NGOs have no reserves to be able to deal with shock. Now, we know our clients don't either. That's why there's so many people who are on the unemployment, the job seeker and JobKeeper arrangements as it is. The second thing is it is about funding. And what the crisis has shown is that block funding does work. And discretionary funding in the hands of NGOs is a very appropriate mechanism for funding. So whilst we need fee-for-service and client-centred and client-directed, what this crisis has demonstrated is the value of block funding to NGO organisations. And discretionary arrangements within that are important. Now, of course, people will say, well, this is only because it's a crisis and we have to act quickly. But I think there are lessons out of this that some portion of the funding that goes to the sector in relation to programs has to be discretionary in nature or at least flexible in the way that it can be delivered. And whilst I know that's a hard message because it goes against everything we've been doing for the last 30 years, I think this particular crisis shows that. When you have to respond, NGOs are reliable partners who can be trusted with large sums of money and can spend it wisely according to the needs of people. But somehow we've got to get back to putting that back into the funding mix. And lastly, I think it is a very interesting time to look at philanthropy. Why and what are the lessons going to be learned out of the philanthropic area? And I think it's too early to know. Certainly at the moment, it appears that there are forecasts that philanthropy will reduce by about between 10 to 15% in the next financial year, and something of that order in this financial year. But who knows the answer to that? But I think it is a time to actually look at our philanthropic base and to say, what are the learnings? And every organisation that I'm involved in are learning about that. What they thought was stable funding and secure is much less so. On the other hand, it's very interesting that some forms of philanthropic funding has actually stood up and is in fact increasing as we're talking. So I don't pretend to have the answer for that, but it is a really good time to have a look at our fundamental philanthropic underpinning. What is clear that we've got to convince philanthropists that some money spent on building resilience in organisations is actually very valuable and very worthwhile. And I think this shock shows that. If the NGO sector isn't strong and isn't stable, it's not able to respond as an effective partner. Now, we'll wait and see how that happens. The second part of the resilience, I think, is workforce. And the question, and I don't know, is how resilient has our workforces been in the NGO sector generally? Have they been up to the mark? Have they been able to deal with crisis in an effective way? Have there been gaps, shortages in both skills, capacity, and frankly, just numbers? And that's not clear. At the moment, there's mixed messages coming out about that. In the disability sector, there was a very strong view that there was a crisis in the workforce. The NDIS latest data shows that that's probably not the case. I think we just got to wait and see. But I do think it's an opportunity to say what's happened to our workforce in this space. Where are the gaps? Where are the weaknesses? Where are the strengths? And what do we need as sector leaders to really embrace a resilient workforce going through? And I have talked previously to NCOS and others about emotional resilience as being part of that. Have our workforces coped well under pressure, both for their clients and in the organisations? The second thing I would say is about service level gaps. I don't think we could have had a better sort of real life experiment in what gaps there are in our service areas: health, education, disability, ageing, and you can probably housing and so on. So I don't think I've ever experienced a time when we can actually look across 4 or 5 of our key mainstream service activities and say, what has the gaps identified? And on a micro level, we know that infection control and all those sorts of things have been looked at. I know Health Department in New South Wales has identified a whole range of gaps that they now think they could have done better. But it takes a crisis to demonstrate that. But the critical issue for us is, can the sector now do a gaps analysis based on the services that they've been offering? Not wait for government, but to actually say, in relation to these areas, we, the sector in New South Wales, have identified real gaps or weaknesses. And whilst it seems an odd spot to do it in while you're in the crisis, it's actually when they're probably top of mind, you can identify them quite quickly, and that fades over time. Now, the gaps analysis is really important because I don't think we're very good at that. And I think a crisis identifies the gaps that now exist. Now, do they only exist because it's a crisis, or were there fundamental weaknesses there before the crisis hit? And I think that's the question. The other part of that, however, is the strength side of that. Where has the sector really demonstrated its capacity, and where have the service systems really worked very well? And attentive to that also, I think, is what are the innovations that have happened during the crisis that we now need to keep going? So I know in New South Wales, you're aware that New South Wales government has reintroduced, I think, a program for contacting vulnerable people in social housing. Now, most of you would be aware that Red Cross started that years ago. The New South Wales government extended that to public housing tenants for a while. and Joanna can correct me, but I think at some point that funding ceased, and it's now been reintroduced. Now that's a
only if you're over 60. Only if you're over 60.
Over 60. But you say, well, is that an important part of our social housing process going forward, public or social housing? Is that a program that has merit in and of itself, not just because of the crisis, but more generally? And the answer to that is, from my point of view, yes, absolutely, because it's dealing with a vulnerability or an at-risk group. And that's not just the crisis that's caused that vulnerability. There are other factors that arise. So what are the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 things that the Commonwealth and the state governments have done innovatively that actually we can say, look, these are terrific and should continue, not just because they're in response to a crisis. And I think that's really important. And really, I've never been in a position where so much has happened that actually identifies strength and weakness in service capacity and delivery issues. And I know in the NDIS space there's been a lot of learnings out of it. The aged care space, I'm not sure about the learnings just yet, but you're experts in that space. So if I can just go to a policy area generally, and I know that there's great work being done by the Community Council at the Commonwealth level, by ACOS, by a whole lot of sector groups. And I even think, Joanna, there's a thing called a charities cabinet being formed or something of that ilk. I'm not quite sure what it's called. But I just want to pick up some key points which most of you may be aware of. Clearly, the most important role of both the government and the community generally, the community sector, is re-engagement of people in employment. And I won't talk about that because that's true in all recessions. But there's 3 or 4 things that are worth. Policy terms, you'd be aware that there is a COVID response, a national response committee being formed. And that has a number of commissioners, I think they're called. And the CEO of that is Peter Harris, ex-chair of Productivity Commission. There's a document that was produced by Peter when he was chair of the Productivity Commission called Shifting the Dial in 2017. That's an incredibly important document. It was a document that was trying to look at what are the next major reforms that need to take place in the non-market part of our economy. That is your part. And there's a lot of stuff in there about health reform, education, but particularly vet reform, reforms to the way governments operate, innovation, and so on. And that document seems to have been resurrected very substantially at the Commonwealth level at this time. So there are things that will guide the current government, and that's one of the documents that you should just have a look at and a read of if you can. The second thing is that if we're not careful, all of the old ideologies, however, are about to come out into play. So if you've been around the sector long enough, you know what it's going to be. The business sector is immediately going to go back to issues of tax cuts and so on and so forth. Now, frankly, there's nothing new under the sun coming from the business community. And I've been around the business community as commercial work and in the advocacy. So the danger here is that the policy agenda very quickly will move back to its normal ideological basis, and the remedies will be no more than they've ever been over the last 20 or 30 years, and they'll fail us very badly. The question is whether or not the sector has an alternative narrative that can run contrary to those old philosophies. And the old philosophies are very strong, particularly in the coalition, but more generally than that. So the question is, what's the narrative coming out of the sector going to be to counter those sorts of areas? But there are 3 or 4 significant ones, and then I'll stop. The first one is the crisis has shown us the importance of community engagement and the importance of community generally in supporting vulnerable people. And only the social sector, the social service sector, understands that. And the truth of the matter is that whatever the risks have been to vulnerable people during this crisis, they would have been considerably worse but for the non-government sector providing community support and engagement in very effective ways at local and regional level. And the sector has to really push the fact that it is the only player in town when it comes to that. And it's critically important that we build it into our service models. Vulnerable people need the community to be engaged with them in order to deal with their concerns and risks. And I think the sector really has an enormous strength, and it's demonstrated that this time around. The second one, and I absolutely support Joanna's and NCOS's push on this, is affordable housing, but it's also linked to income support. I do absolutely think, unlike after every recession where we have failed to be able to get affordable housing, this might be the one where that really works. Now, affordable housing has been on the community sector's agenda after every recession without fail. So it's an old campaign, but it really is a very important campaign. And it has really strong economic benefits, but also social benefits. So I do think this is one opportunity where we've really got to push affordable housing as a means of aiding employment, but also aiding disadvantage. It is a really big issue. Now, for reasons which I don't understand, we've not been able to get traction on housing affordability over the last 5 or 6 years. And in New South Wales, it's at a shocking state. And everyone knows that. And yet we've not been able to get really solid results. So I think this is a time, and I'm sure the government will be attuned to that. And it is linked to income support. Now, I know this is not so much at New South Wales level, but what it has demonstrated, what you've already known, is inadequate income support is a huge increases the risks for vulnerable people. The challenge will be in relation to job seeker when the government removes the supplement is what they're prepared to do in terms of actually increasing the base rate. But can I make this point to the sector? And I think I heard, I think, Joanna, you did a radio interview or an interview the other day, and it's really selling the benefits to society and to individuals about that benefit. But what we've seen with the supplement is we can now demonstrate absolutely the benefits of a just and fair income support proves. Instead of saying, it's less than the age pension, it's inequitable, it's unfair, all true. I think this gives us a real chance to say, look at the benefits that it has delivered to these families. Less rental stress, less stress within the family, the ability to buy fresh food, all of those sorts of things. So I think the income support story has to be sold by saying we now have the clear evidence that an increase in these benefits absolutely works, rather than arguing the unfairness and the inequality of them, which frankly doesn't seem to move anybody at the moment on anything. But I think that's a really important one. It's less of a concern for the New South Wales scene, but I think it is an important one. Another one is the use of technology. And I think that the sector has always been a bit of a laggard in relation to technology. And it's not a field of expertise. But what is clear is that we've had to come up with technological solutions to meeting the needs of people in health and in all other sorts of areas, education and so on. And I think this is a great opportunity for the sector to really look back and say, in relation to our service areas, what are the technological changes that have been introduced in relation to COVID that we can now continue to use? Which of those that have not been as successful, and there are some failures out there. Most importantly is how do we really build technology into our service systems going forward? And again, I've never seen anything like this. This is a perfect experiment. All of us are experiencing the need to change the way we operate, but also the way we need to connect to our client group and keep them connected. And I can't believe that any of the learnings out of this COVID crisis would be lost. I think that in the disability space, the ageing space, generally, I think the learnings are enormous. And I do think the sector has to really very quickly get on top of that. Now, I don't have the answers for that, and I don't pretend to understand the answers. I do know that face-to-face, the valuing of personal contact, all matters. So these are not replacement. But this is a really extraordinary opportunity for the sector to say we've really looked at this issue, and there are half a dozen things that we've really learned in relation to technological change. Politically, it will also be very attractive. I think one of the things that will have come out of this is the notion that we can and must and should use technology more. And I do think in service delivery and in the community sector that's important. Can I come back then where it started with a lovely entree by Joanna into this and about your role in it? In 1991, the fundamental nature of government changed. And everyone is saying during this crisis that the fundamental nature of government has again changed. I think this is really not clear to me yet, but the first thing is People trust the government to deliver in a time of crisis. Will that continue beyond this crisis? Will there be a renewed belief by the Australian people that government matters and government can be trusted? Now, in America, I don't think there's any possibility of that happening. I think in America, they will go back to their partisan ways and government will be as distrusted as it was. In Australia, I think it's very different. And the question then is, what is the role of government going forward? In the 1990s, however, what happened, despite good reforms by the Labor and Liberal governments in this space, the sector got sidelined to a degree that was unhealthy because government asserted the view that it knew best. So looking at what's worked during this COVID crisis in New South Wales and at the Commonwealth level is critical. So what are the mechanisms that Joanna referred to have actually worked? As you know, Minister Ward and Minister Lee, the Health Department, they've all got these sort of meetings taking place with various groups. There's communities of practice. Health has 30-something communities of practice. I'm on one dealing with disability and health, and I think there's 100 participants in it, which is mind-numbingly nuts. But anyway, it's a good attempt and it's a good conversation. So I think it's really important to say we've demonstrated during the crisis that these mechanisms work and work well. So I think we're in a unique position not to say we think we should have this, but to actually say you've initiated this government, we think these should continue and with these modifications. The second thing I think is sector planning. Will this lead to a genuine desire by the governments, both Commonwealth and New South Wales, to really start to plan and give currency to co-design of service systems going forward? They've worked well together. We've worked well together in this space. Why can't we work well together in the development of longer-term strategies, plans, and service systems? And I think it may not come to be. It may be that everyone goes back into their own corners. But I think it's a really extraordinary thing to be able to say, look, we've actually demonstrated we can work well together in relation to these matters, and these principles can be applied more generally. I think that's quite different to what happened in the 1990s, and it's quite different to what happened in the 1980s. And it is because this crisis, the health side of it at least, has forced us to work together. Economic recessions by themselves don't necessarily do that, but this one has a different genesis. So what's worked for you? The third thing is surely the notion of collaboration must have regained energy in the sector itself. Yes, we compete for grants and funds, and yes, in a client-directed funding, there are competitive elements, and the market won't disappear. I think there will be an adjustment to the markets. I think the NDIS will be adjusted. I think some of the stuff in the aged care area will be adjusted. But market-driven approaches are not going to disappear, and neither should they. But collaboration has been the essence, collaboration between the Commonwealth and the state governments, collaboration between business, the non-government sector and governments variously across Australia. Surely collaboration has been proven to be effective. Now, the problem in Australia is we deal very well with disasters. Australia has a significant reputation based on our dealing with natural disasters. We do it very well, and we work together very well. But a few months after the event, that's dissipated. And I've said before, economic recessions in and of themselves don't do that. So is this so different that we can actually say our learning out of the crisis is collaboration and demonstrate the effectiveness of that as an ongoing approach going forward? The governments talk that way. Ministers individually talk that way. Sector talks that way. So can we demonstrate it and actually put it forward as part of the way forward? And I go back to the comment that I made before about the sector narrative. What is it? What is, if we say that, as some people in the media say, this is we're all going to be different after this, then the question is, what are we going to be different about, and what it's going to look like? My fear is that dominant agendas of the old guard of the past, business and others, will dominate yet again. But I think there is a window of opportunity for a new narrative to be put. and it can be put in a positive way, that we've demonstrated that these have positive outcomes for the community and for individuals, for agencies and so on. So I think it comes from, we don't have to argue the ideology. We can argue the demonstrated effect of having done it during the crisis. Now, I'll conclude by saying that all might come to naught. This is a game for the not for the faint-hearted. And if you speculate, you're bound to be wrong. But I do think that some of the messages are out there now. There's other people in the sector that have been, looking at these issues deeply, and there are very prophetic voices out in the sector and beyond. But I do think the nature of this crisis is so different that it creates its own problems, but it also creates its extraordinary different opportunities, and to articulate a different vision based on some learnt practices. All that aside, if the sector stays in a survival mentality for the next 2 or 3 years, others will make those choices on our behalf as a community. And my learning out of 82, but particularly out of 1991, 92, is we can't let that happen. And we can't let that happen in government, and we can't let that happen in the NGO sector or anywhere else in society. So, look, I think, Joanna, I'll leave that there. That's sort of a tour de force.
Yeah, no, look, that was fantastic, Robert, and I'm very pleased that you've allowed us to video it, because I think people will want to go back and reflect on what you've said. You've articulated a whole lot of the issues that we've been mulling over today, but in other forums as well. But I think you've done it in a way that is a bit more structured and strategic and has that longer-term view. And I think it is really important that we step back from the immediate and from the crisis and start thinking in that way.